Greetings and salutations, this is Huge Ass, the biggest YouTuber ever! And it's time for another History Time. And with me to do the History Time is PhD Tony. Welcome, Tony.
Greetings, Hugh. Season's greetings, in fact.
Yes, did you have a good Christmas?
I did. I got to hang out with some of my family. Had a good time.
That's great.
Watched some cricket. So yes, all good as far as I'm concerned, and
Wonderful.
feeling fairly reasonable.
Yes, you seem that way. That's great. It's always good to have a happy Tony.
All right. Yes, and hello, Peter Collins. The only person I presently see in the chat, but hope everybody in the chat also had a wonderful holiday season.
Yes, yeah. It's not just Christmas, of course, and there's lots of other things. Hello, Daryl M, who just said good evening.
Yes.
And I hope my ceiling fan isn't making too much noise. It's just a little bit muggy here. It is summer after all.
It is.
Yes, and I hope it's not making too much distracting noise.
No.
So we're going monochromatic light source. Good morning to you. So today we're going to have a look at the early Saxon kings. So we looked at Saxon kings last time. That was back in May, would you believe? And but we missed important kings like Offa and Hengist and things like that. So
Yes.
and this time the tables are a bit turned. Instead of me doing the presentation and Tony correcting me, Tony's done the presentation. And so I'll have very little to contribute because I know Tony's going to be correct. But I will say a few things now here and there.
Okay. Well, I'm hoping I can just share this and okay. Here we go. So,
My side.
can everybody see that?
I'm not getting anything.
Can you not? Okay.
Oh, hang on. Here it comes. There we go.
All right.
Oh, that looks good.
Yes. So here we've got a map of what Britain looked like at the end of the Roman occupation, because the story of the Anglo-Saxon invasion of England is one of dwindling Roman military presence. So by around 400 CE, the Central Roman Authority was breaking down, and there were lots of people who were deciding that with a few soldiers they could make a stab at the throne. So they were pulling soldiers out of areas where they thought that they could do without them, and one of those places was Britain, at that time. And so the Romans pulled their legions out, a succession of sort of people who wanted to be emperor, pulled more and more people out, and eventually by 410 CE, the emperor was saying, look, you guys are going to have to look after yourselves, which was a bit of a problem because England was currently being raided by three foreign groups, the Caledonians and Picts to the north, the Irish to the west, and the Saxons along the east coast. In fact, the Saxons had long been a problem, and the Romans had set up what were called the Saxon forts to try and fend off the raiding. So the British found themselves with a bit of a problem how to defend themselves from this tide. And the story goes, well, we've got some historical sources, so let's discuss those first. There's a chap called Gildas who wrote a piece called The Ruin of Britain. He saw the Anglo-Saxons as a punishment for British sins. Now, he was writing in about 540, 530 CE. And during this period, the Anglo-Saxon expansion into Britain had actually been stopped. The Anglo-Saxons had suffered a large military reverse, whose ultimate source we don't know, but a lot of people attribute it to the efforts of Arthur, or a military defeat at a place called Mons Badonicus that we don't know where it is. We've got a later writer, Bede the Venerable Bede, from 700 to 730, who wrote an ecclesiastical history of the English people. He's an Anglo-Saxon cleric, an unapologetic Christian propagandist, and basically he viewed all historical figures by their attitude to the church. People who were pro-church were good, people who were anti-church were bad. And he didn't understand why the Welsh held a grudge about the Anglo-Saxons conquering them and was very resentful about it. We've got a poem called Y Godothan, which is from the Book of Aneurin, who's a sort of semi-mythical Old Welsh poet. And this has been dated anywhere from the 6th century to the 11th century. But there's really no reason to doubt that it's at least a 7th century creation. So within the lifetime of the event that it describes, which is the climactic battle between the warriors of a kingdom called Godothan and the Northumbrian Anglo-Saxons, which the Godothan warriors lost around 600 CE. There's a 9th century Welsh historian by the name of Nennius who wrote his Historia Britonum that contains the first really detailed description of the military campaigns of Arthur, and claims that Arthur won 12 victories over the Anglo-Saxons, climaxing with the defeat at Mons Badonicus. And the story is that this stopped the Anglo-Saxon expansion for about 50 years before they resumed it. And after that 50-year hiatus, they continued their conquest. Beginning in the late 9th century, we've got our old friend Alfred the Great and his mates, who established and recorded the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. An English monarch and scholar assembling a history of the English-speaking peoples. Now, we do have other sources. We've got some continental sources, but these are the main historical sources that we're looking at, and they're kind of limited. Do you have anything you want to contribute to any of this, or just butt in if you do?
Well, I was just letting you go. Arthur was probably the main thing. There are many. Arthur's probably a composite of many different sources. Vortigern it's a title meaning basically the overlord. And that's actually probably a point to make, that back in this time, we're not talking about kings as we sort of understand them, like Henry VIII or anything like that. We're talking about people who are basically warlords who managed to get enough people together to protect whatever land they had and resources they had available to them on that land. And over time, they sort of intermarried or killed off the other ones, and they grew into proper kingdoms as a result. And that's when we got the heptarchy, which I'm sure you're going to talk about soon.
Yes, well, that's exactly right. Starting here, we're going to start with the first person that I think deserves a mention, deserves a Guernsey, is Hengist. Who is, according to the stories that we're told, he was the leader of the Anglo-Saxon mercenaries that were hired by Vortigern to defend Britain against Irish and Pictish raiding. This was a tactic that was fairly common in the Roman era, and it seems fairly plausible that the Romano-Britons would use this. Basically, you recruit one of your border problems to fend off the other border problems. The Romans did this a lot, and there's no reason to doubt that the Romano-Britons did this. And there is some archaeological support for this idea, in that there are a couple of settlements in East Anglia, northern East Anglia, where you start seeing Anglo-Saxon burials that are consistent with sort of a federation of troops. But the story goes that Hengist and his brother Horsa, Hengist means stallion, Horsa obviously means horse. I discover in my research that Horsa the word horse is actually etymologically related to hurry or carry. It's not actually the Indo-European word for horse, which is equus or equa. Anyway, Hengist and his brother are reputed to have summoned 35 tribes of Angles, Jutes, and Saxons from Scandinavia, and they forcibly seized control of Britain. And this process was complete by 450 CE. Hengist was the first Jutish king of what would become called Kent. Now, Hengist is mentioned elsewhere. The name Hengist occurs in two other sources that might be of interest. One is Beowulf, and the other one is the Battle of Finnsburg. Now, this is it's actually only mentioned in the Battle of Finnsburg, but the Battle of Finnsburg is mentioned in Beowulf. And so we're double dipping a little bit here. But we've got a fairly complete understanding of Beowulf. The Battle of Finnsburg, we've only got one page from. And that was badly copied down by somebody who didn't really who wasn't really a great scholar before the original was burnt. Now, no less a prodigy than J.R.R. Tolkien had a look at this, and he thought that Horsa may in fact be Hengist's nickname, because there's no mention of Horsa in the Battle of Finnsburg or Beowulf. But Hengist is a major character, is the central character in both of these stories. So he was fairly convinced that Hengist was a historical inspiration of some sort, but he thought that Horsa might be a nickname, given that his actual name meant stallion. So, on the other hand, most modern scholars think that Hengist and Horsa are both myth, that they weren't real people, and the fact that they're named after they've named after animals, and their claimed lineage is from gods, kind of throws some cold water on the idea of them being historical people.
Wait, you can't be descended from gods?
Well, apparently the academics get all snitty about it and say that you might not be real if you start claiming that sort of stuff. I don't know. It's one of their prejudices. Anyway, and this is a picture of what Britain looked like in sort of the time of by the time of Gildas.
Good, I used that on the thumbnail.
All right. So Kent, which is where Hengist was, and Bede says that there was a monument to Horsa that was still around when he visited there a couple of centuries later.
Can I just point out, Tony, this is pre-Viking, what we're talking about here.
This is pre-Viking, yeah.
Yeah, this is 500, 600 AD. Vikings were more 800, 900.
Yeah.
So there was the Great Heathen Army landed in Kent in about 840 from memory, something like that.
Yeah.
So we're way before that. I mean, they're effectively Vikings because they're from the same area, but it's before they were considered Vikings.
Yes, yeah.
In fact, they were invited in most cases, as you said earlier, that they wanted that the locals wanted to take on the guys next door, so they invited in mercenaries who were Saxons and Angles and things, and the Saxons and Angles for some reason wanted to stay. So
yes, and be in charge, because they thought that the Romano Britons didn't have what it took, and push comes to shove, they were kind of shown to be correct. So here now those two in the north, you can see Godolphin, which is way up the top there, which is the origin of that poem that I mentioned previously. South of that, Bernicia and Dira are actually sub-kingdoms of what will later be called Northumbria. And this is actually reasonably common. The kingship was often split. We refer to the kingship of Kent, for instance, but Kent seems to have had an eastern king and a western king. So the succession that you were mentioning before, the complications of the politics here are very, very real. And we discussed this a little bit in our previous history of Saxon kings, how sometimes, younger brothers would end up being sort of sub-kings of some sort, and farmed off with, some lesser property. Happened to Alfred's dad after he came back from France, if people recall the previous episode. Anyway, but the heptarchy, which is, I forgot to capitalize, consists of Essex, Sussex, Wessex, East Anglia, Kent, Northumbria, and Mercia. And there are a couple of other territories that are mentioned there, Middle Anglians, South Anglians, but they eventually, and Lindsay, they eventually disappeared.
Can we just mention that for those who aren't British, I guess, so Essex means the East Saxons, Sussex means the Southern Saxons, Wessex means the Western Saxons, and they're terms that Sussex and Essex at least are around today.
Yes, that's right. So is Mercia. They remain formal delineations of what is now England.
If I can just make one more point, Tony, sorry. Two actually. Northumbria means north of the Humber River. That's where that term comes from. And I noticed you said Gothen, which is the correct way to pronounce it. A double D in Welsh is a TH sound. And that's significant because that's what the ancient Britons spoke. What modern Welsh is a evolution of what the ancient Britons spoke. So way up there was where the ancient Britons were, and they moved back to Wales. Well, they fought back to Wales, I guess, as the Saxons moved in.
Yes. So they generally move northward and westward, being driven out of the way. You can see the major kingdoms of Reged, Powys, Gwynedd, the kingdoms of Dumnonia or Cornwall in the southwest, and these all played their part. And Elmet, which is actually sort of linked to our story as we're going to go on. Now,
Tony,
it's time to.
Got a question from Judy Bassett. What does Lindsay mean? Do you know the answer to that?
It's unclear. So Lindsay was a territory that was occupied by a particular group, and it was distinguished from the others. But there are a couple of these terms that we don't really know the history of that closely. Lindsay turns out not to survive very long as an independent nation. It tends to get, and the Middle Anglians and the South Anglians and the Gewis, they all end up being absorbed into other political entities. So actually, I don't have a good understanding. Sorry, just a second. Forgot to do that. Turn off. Anyway. Power off. Okay. It's fascinating that I've got to actually negotiate with my phone to get it to turn off. Anyway, I don't have a very detailed understanding of sort of Lindsay, but it ends up being sort of a pawn in between the larger players, what turn out to be the sort of the larger operators in the evolution. So I'm afraid Judy's caught me in a bit of ignorance there. I'm not that familiar with the history of Lindsay, but it does survive as a last name and indeed as a first name. But what we're interested in are the major rulers of the Anglo-Saxons, and we're fortunate that there is a term Bretwalda, which means wide ruler or ruler of Britain. Probably the former. I don't see why the English would would be referring to this as Britain. Anyway, this is a title coined by Bede, and it is accorded to the more prominent of the Anglo-Saxon kings. And
I'm just thinking that if I was a ruler, I'd be a white ruler.
Yeah, you would indeed, and indeed prominent on account of that. Sadly, you weren't alive at a time to qualify. And here are the 7 that Bede considered. However, to me, they all seem like pretty complete non-entities, whose only achievements involve something to do with the church. So Aile of Sussex was, sort of he was the first Anglo-Saxon ruler to convert to Christianity. Ceawlin of Sussex had some sort of deputation from the Romans sent to him, etc., etc. Typical of Bede's preoccupation with his religion, all of these people did stuff that was good for Christianity in Britain, but didn't really, in material terms, didn't really help. And this is one of the problems that we have generally, is that it's Christian clerics who record a lot of these early histories. And so they tend to interpret this through their lens, and it provides a very distorted reality to us thousands of years later. These were 7 guys Bede thought of as important, but in terms of the overall evolution of the English kingdoms, no, not so much.
Yeah, I think there's a point to be made there that Bede was a monk, so he was focused on the church, so he was probably trying to put the church spin into the history that he was writing. Yes.
And so we're going to move on to the first king that I consider to really have been a Bretwalda in any real sense, and this is Penda of Mercia. Now you may notice the last 3 of these names, Edwin of Deira, Oswald of Northumbria, and Oswiu of Northumbria, they're all from Northumbria. So there was this period here where Northumbria was actually sort of arguably the largest and most powerful of the kingdoms. Penda fought at the Battle of Hatfield Chase, where Edwin was defeated and killed. He captured Edwin's son, who was later killed in captivity. The argument is that he became king of the Mercians after this. In order to, at that battle, he was actually allied with some British kings who were fighting against the rule of the Northumbrians. So Edwin was a great king and Bretwalda right up until he was killed by Penda and his mates. And then Penda defeated the East Anglians, killing their king and their former king, who had been pulled out of a monastery, much against his will. And then he defeated the Northumbrians again at the Battle of Mayserfield. I've left out an R, where Oswald was killed. So two of Bede's candidates for Bretwalda were defeated and killed by Penda, but apparently Penda doesn't deserve to be on the list of Bretwalda. And the reason for that might be Penda was a pagan. So it's possible that Bede, again, allowed his religious convictions to sort of blind him to the fact that, Penda actually kicked a lot of ass and established Mercian supremacy. Mercia was by far the largest and most influential of the English kingdoms through most of the next 2 centuries, and it was only when it was eventually it was only with the rise of Alfred of Wessex that situation changed, and even then Wessex remained important. But unfortunately, unfortunately for Penda, he was defeated by Oswiu and the Northumbrians at the Battle of Winwade and killed. So at least one of Bede's Bretwalders wasn't a complete loser.
So, Tony, with these battles, what sort of do you have any information on them? How many people are involved in these sorts of battles at this stage in history?
At this stage, it would be hundreds to thousands of people. So you'd be very unlikely to have an army in excess of 5,000 people in a battle. These would be reasonably small affairs, which is why they were so lethal for the people in charge. There was nowhere to really hide once you lost the battle. Whereas once armies got larger, the generals could, sort of make their way away. These were, in historical terms, these are fairly small scale conflicts. At the Battle of Godolphin, for instance, the forces of Godolphin, I think they total about 1,000 people for that battle, and about the same on the Anglo-Saxon side. So these were major events for their time, but the number of people were relatively small by today's standards.
And we've got to remember the population was much smaller back then too. So
yeah.
It's all a matter of scale.
Yes, exactly so. The next person I would consider to be a Bretwalder would be Penda's son, Wulfhere, the first Christian king of Mercia, who freed Mercia from Northumbrian occupation and inflicted some military losses on Wessex that recaptured the Thames Valley, but he failed to conquer Northumbria. Unfortunately, his career was cut short because he died of disease in 675. But again, while he was alive and during his reign, Mercia was the most powerful of the kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.
Is that his reign period there, or his age?
No, his birth was in 645. So
right.
He would have taken over shortly after Penda's death. So Penda was succeeded by his son Peda, but Peda was murdered. And so Wulfhere became king in about 656. So shortly after his father's death, but not immediately. There was an intermediate.
He's only 16. Jeez.
Yeah.
You said Christian king. Christianity was sort of still fairly new to Britain at that point.
Yes,
St. Columba came in about 540, something around there.
Yes.
And of course, we didn't have the internet or anything like that. It didn't spread that fast. But being a Christian was more a political thing than anything else, as the Vikings showed later, a couple of centuries later. It was more about, because the Romans had taken on Christianity. It sort of was symbolic with power and things like that. So it was more a political thing than. We can't read their minds, of course. They might have thought it was pretty real. But it was clearly a political thing at least.
Well, it was, and there was a tension in terms of the Irish Christianity, of which that St. Columba represented, and the Roman branch that Augustine and his representatives brought into Kent, establishing their seat at Canterbury, which became sort of the preeminent church in England.
That battle between the Celtic Church and the Roman Church was quite fascinating. You'd see it in the place names, all in the west of Britain. They're much more the Celtic saints, who aren't real saints according to the Catholic Church, but on the East Coast, it's more the Catholic type of saints.
Yes, and it's worth bearing in mind that all this came to a head at the Synod of Whitby, where the English Church was brought into conformity. Well, the Church in Britain was brought into conformity with the Roman Church, the standards of the Roman Church. So up until that time, the Irish Church had been celebrating Easter at Passover. This was something that the Roman Church didn't do because the date of Passover was, based on the first full moon after the spring equinox or something like that, the Northern Hemisphere spring equinox. So it changed. You had to keep an eye on the stars and on the and everything, and that was unpredictable. So they had a sort of an idealized system for doing this calculation, so that they could calculate when Easter should be years in advance, which makes sense for a big international church to want to do. But the Irish were still going, well, it should be on Passover, and we know how to calculate the date for Passover. So, but anyway, at the Synod of Whitby, the Roman Church was adopted as the standard that would prevail in the British Isles. So anyway, after Wulfhere was succeeded by Ethelred, and Ethelred really kicked the Northumbrians' ass, defeated them at the Battle of Trent, and this ended Northumbria as a significant political force in Anglo-Saxon terms. Northumbrians never again exerted any sort of influence south of the Humber. In this, he took the territory of Lindsey, which had been controlled by the Northumbrians, and he brought it back under Mercian control, and it never again slipped away. So it was basically an extension of Mercia by this point and forever forward. So this is what I mean about Lindsey having limited scope as an independent entity. It was kind of traded back and forth as a trophy by Northumbria and Mercia until Mercia are finally established lasting control. Ethelred's. Sorry,
go on. Tony, if I can just add to that. So at this point, up until this point, there was basically three factions that had the majority of the power, which was the Wessex people from Wessex, the Mercians, and the Northumbrians. Yes. And around this time, the Northumbrians are even moving into Scotland. There's the famous Battle of Neckman's Sphere, where the Scots basically turned them around. So there was that sort of three-way tug of war, you might say, between the Saxons in the south, the Mercians in the middle, and the Northumbrians in the north. And as you were saying, it's when the Northumbrians went off, it became between Mercia and Wessex, basically.
Yeah.
So this is quite a significant point in the history of Britain in terms of where it could go from now. If the Northumbrians had prevailed, they might well have become the dominant faction. Who knows?
Yes. Well,
history is fun that way.
History is fun that way. And you can see on the map. So by the time we've reached now, the Godolphin disappeared, and Manaur Godolphin, which was the little northern element, they'd already been conquered by the Northumbrians, so their border extended up to the Caledonians, what we would call the Scottish nowadays. That kingdom of Elmet had disappeared. It was under Mercian control. Lindsey was now under Mercian control. And the Middle Anglians and South Anglians were kind of under Mercian control. So Mercia controlled a huge amount of territory in the centre there. and the the kingdom of Wessex was not as large, but it was strategically vital in terms of trade networks with the continent, and it was a very wealthy and influential place that eventually rose to supremacy. But yeah, Wessex was always regarded as a rival to Mercian control, and Wessex was really not brought under. Wessex was never really made entirely dependent on Mercia in the way that other kingdoms were, and we're going to get into that in a little bit. But this was one of Ethelred's failings, was that despite the fact that he really crushed the Northumbrians, he failed to exert control over southern England. And this was something that two of his successors would do to great extent. Now, I'm going to skip Ethelbald and go straight to the big guy, which is Offa of Mercia. Now, he became king in 757 after the assassination of Ethelbald. Now, Ethelbald by this stage had sort of cemented Mercia's significance, but he hadn't really done anything that notable. Mercia was influential and it was wealthy, but Offa really turned Mercia into kind of a European power. So in terms of political maneuvering, he manipulated rivalries in Sussex and Kent. There were multiple claimants to the throne, and he offered sort of patronage and funding to keep them disabled, and they sort of granted him superiority. They sort of granted him seniority as a ruler in return for his support in trying to become king. Militarily, he raided Wales a bunch of times. Like he put up he had like something like 5 different raids into Wales, none of which are sort of recorded as being disasters. So he must have been doing something. He must have been accomplishing something. But in the south, he defeated Cynewulf, king of Wessex, at the Battle of Bensington in 779 CE. Now, this feeds into the story in the lead up to Alfred, if you remember, because Cynewulf's successor, Beorhtric, was supported by Offa and married to one of Offa's daughters, and this was seen as she was seen as a sort of foreign interloper, in much the way Alfred's father's second wife was seen as a foreign interloper, and the reason she caused so much hostility was because of this marriage to Beorhtric. She was seen in the historical record as being arrogant, demanding, and just interfering in political matters that she had no business. So this particular, while Offa failed, you can see he's trying to work to assert Mercian supremacy, but through the happenstance of history, what he actually did was set in motion a series of events that led to Alfred's ultimate rise. In terms of organization and legal codes, Offa really stands out. We have trade treaties that he made with Charlemagne. He negotiated a marriage of his daughter to one of Charlemagne's sons. He wanted to he wanted to marry one of his sons to one of Charlemagne's daughter, which so insulted Charlemagne that Charlemagne cut off all trade with England. But it gives you some idea of sort of how Offa saw himself in relation to Charlemagne. He saw himself as a peer. Charlemagne clearly didn't see him as a peer, and was insulted by the comparison. But the fact that they were in contact, they were contemporaries, they knew of one another. Charlemagne's advisor, Alcuin, came for, was sent to Charlemagne by Offa. At the same time, perhaps inspired by Charlemagne, Offa introduced gold coins and had a sophisticated array of coinage, and had a fairly sophisticated international diplomatic agenda that he tried to implement. And in terms of organization and resources, he built a 100-kilometer earthen dike across the western border that still survives to this day. It was a fairly massive thing. There were Mercian settlements further west, so the Mercians decided where they wanted to put up this ditch and rampart fortification. On the right here, you can see some of Offa's gold coins. You can see his name there, Offa Rex. So we're started by this stage in history, having started off with sort of the semi-mythical Hengist and Hortha. We're starting to get, by Offa's time, we're certainly firmly in the midst of history that is recorded from multiple sides, from the continental side, from the English side, from the clerical side, and from the secular side as well. So we've got fairly, and Offa was Offa was doing deals and making trade with the large Frankish kingdom, which at that stage was one of the largest in Europe, largest and most powerful and wealthiest in Europe. So as an English ruler, he attained a prominence that his predecessors wouldn't, I think, have really dreamed of.
Absolutely, yeah. He's probably the most famous king from that time.
Yes.
I won't make comment about Offa's dike, though. There's a lot of controversy about it, actually, amongst historians. In some places, it appears to be Roman. And as you can see there, it's not going to really hold the Welsh out. It was on the border between Wales and England. So what was the purpose of it is what people discuss.
Well, there are multiple points to make here. There are a lot of place names along the dike that do seem to link it to Offa and the period of Offa. And the fact that some of it might be Roman is might be true, but there was a lot of repurposing of Roman fortifications. Most of the early Anglo-Saxon occupation sites, the earliest Anglo-Saxon occupation sites, are near and around and in Roman fortifications, which makes perfect sense because they're troops and they're there allegedly as defenders. So being closely associated with fortifications makes sense. It doesn't really serve as a
it's not like Hadrian's Wall, put it that way.
It's not like Hadrian's Wall, but even Hadrian's Wall was kind of porous, right? And the fact that there were West Saxon settlements to the further west than the dike suggests that it was perhaps an observation, some sort of observation, or just to slow them down, slow any invading force down. And one of the features of sort of Celtic Celtic mythology and culture of this time was the cattle raid. The cattle raid was seen as an important accomplishment for young warriors in building status, and so something that would slow down a bunch of people with a lot of cows, trying to lead cattle back off, would actually have an economic worth to the cattle herders.
Well, I hadn't heard that one before. So what you're saying is this is a massive cattle grid.
Yeah, that's I'm just raising it as a possibility. It may be, I'm by no means certain of that. And
but here in Australia, we're well aware of cattle grids, so
yes,
I'm not sure what it's like elsewhere. I remember in the UK seeing occasional cattle grids, but not a lot. But yes, that's an interesting thought. Another possibility is that it was just a big folly. It's just Offa showing his power that he can get people together to build these sorts of things, and it leaves his legacy for generations, obviously, for millennia to come, really. So
it's a mistake for us to look at to look at these things in purely modern Western perspectives. A lot of these things are, the culture and the approach of the time, were very different. The way they approached constructing things, and indeed the countryside at all, the countryside in general, shaping it and sculpting it, was very different from the way we think of things.
Yeah, unlike Stonehenge, they did have metal tools and things like that, so it was a little bit easier to dig out big ditches and things like that. But that still didn't mean it didn't require the ability to coordinate a whole lot of workforce, and only a king could really bring that together. So that sort of supports the folly idea. Mark Short says, with a structure like that, you could just stand at the top and an attacking army would have to go down, where they would have to try to fight going back uphill. I think that's correct in some places, but from what Tony was showing there, it really wasn't much more than a little bit of a ditch.
Well, I mean, it would have presented a substantial obstacle to a force moving, to a burdened force. So anything that was trying to transport a large amount of loot or a large amount of livestock would have been effectively channeled by the structure. Getting over it would have been difficult. But I'm not sure that I'm not sure that it would necessarily have stopped an army, unless, as Mark says, there was already an army there, and it may have been it may have been combined with a system of lookouts, so that they were warned if there was any substantial force coming. Again, a lot of these structures, they're very different from what we observe. We often think of Hadrian's Wall as just being built to keep out the Caledonians and the Picts, but in fact, there were little tunnels for going through. There were little gates for going through. You could pass either way with horses. So what we tend to view as sort of fixed borders, in reality, would have been sort of rather more permeable, rather more flexible than our modern sensibilities suggest.
Yeah, this isn't really about Hadrian's Wall, but the point of Hadrian's Wall was to control trade, make sure it came through at certain points where they could extract a tax, I imagine. So probably something similar with Offa, only a bit more primitive, I guess.
But you would think that sort of raiding played, rather than sort of large armies. Large armies were certainly put into the field, but endemic raiding would have been one of the things that would have been a major concern. You just dash across, you steal some stuff, you steal some livestock, and then you dash back. This anybody who's seen The Last Kingdom, will know, will have seen the central character do his raid into Wales, and the like I say, the native Britons did have a tradition of cattle theft. It's a long-held Indo-European tradition of stealing cattle from other people. It's sort of something that we don't necessarily have an equivalent to in modern society.
Well, we do. We have cattle duffers still.
We have cattle duffers, and
In Australia, at least.
we do have a and we do have car thieves, etc. But cattle theft was very mainstream. Like, it wasn't, you were stealing other people's cattle to help your settlement. So you could go and steal other people's cattle, and you weren't a thief. You were actually a member in good standing of your society. You were in fact somebody worthy of respect and prestige if you pulled off a cattle raid. It's
and just as another analogy, the Great Wall of China wasn't built to keep the Mongols out; it was to slow them down getting away with all the loot.
Yes,
so
exactly.
That can be recovered.
Yeah, and I mean that's So when you look at these structures, I think it's a mistake to think of them as, in terms of, here's a defensive fortification and we're going to have soldiers here stopping anybody from crossing it. It could be just to direct raiders to prevent passage by large groups of livestock, etc., etc. It's probably one of these multi-purpose things.
And Britain's full of these fascinating sort of earthworks and things like that. It's the history behind it's amazing.
Yes, it is.
You see a thing in the landscape and you think, well, what caused that? That was obviously man-made, and there's a massive story behind it. It's wonderful.
Yeah, and there are, a lot of Europe is is like that. I remember when I was in Sweden, I got taken out into the fields after they'd been ploughed, and there were just heaps and heaps of Neolithic tools, just flint tools everywhere that had been upturned by the ploughs. And I filled a bag with them and took them home. And apparently, my friend was saying, I came out to one of these with a local archaeology student, picked up a tool and asked him if it was a tool, and he said yes, and just threw it over his shoulder, because they're so commonplace. There's just so much of them. This was just a random field, and it was full of flint tools.
We must ask Arctic Reflections about that. Yeah. So, are you stopping your presentation at Offa, or?
I am. I'm not going any further than Offa. Offa's it.
Okay. So, what happened between Offa and Alfred? Can you just say off the top of your head?
So what happened in between Offa and Alfred? Well, the Viking raids started, followed by the Great Army of the Vikings. Alfred's that King of Wessex, Beorhtric, had a very unsuccessful rule, and was eventually ousted in favour of one of Alfred's ancestors. I think his grandfather was installed on the throne, and we covered sort of the lead up to Alfred's eventual rise to the throne of Wessex in the last episode, so I didn't really cover it again in this episode. But the kings of Mercia seem to have declined in quality to the point. One of the defining moments in Alfred's career seems to have been that he turned up to a meeting of the kingdom, the nobles of the kingdom, and seems to have been ousted. And this is where he went into the marshes and waged a guerrilla campaign against the Vikings. But the Vikings had
and burnt some scones.
Yes, and burnt some scones. If the myths are to be believed, but this had happened to a Mercian king. A Mercian king turned up to a meeting, and it turned out that his internal political allies had actually rivals had made an alliance with the Vikings, and they just ousted him. And in effect, the Vikings became rulers of Mercia, and he went into exile and fled. Now, Alfred didn't go into exile and he didn't flee. He stayed and showed a commitment to his people that his people could rally around. But the Mercian king did not do that. He just pissed off and I think went to Rome to try and get help from the Pope, who was not in any position to do him any favors. So that seems to have been sort of a turning point between the two kingdoms. Alfred was prepared to fight to the very last to get his kingdom back, and the Mercian king, after he'd been ousted, decided to go and appeal to a higher authority, and that didn't work out for him. So it's that contrast between what happened in Mercia and what happened in Wessex that seems to have been a defining feature of how Wessex eventually triumphed, because he was able to inspire the people of Wessex to follow him because he was not willing to give up, and eventually inflicted a military defeat and found a way. Found a way to sort of get the Vikings to commit to peace, which they'd had difficulty doing up until then.
And I guess that that's why the Victorians, so many centuries later, decided to give Alfred the title, the epithet, the Great.
Yeah,
which is kind of strange it took them so long, but anyway, I guess the Victorians like to romanticise most things.
They do, and their statue of him is absolutely terrible.
And Boudica, they even mispronounced her name.
Yes.
But for some reason, even though Henry VIII in his time thought he'd be called Henry the Great, no one ever called him that, other than a great fat ass.
Yes, well, the truth was he was a bit ambiguous in a lot of ways, had a lot of I guess coming at the end of sort of decades of civil war, he was particularly ruthless with pruning down potential claimants to the throne.
Given most of them were his own family, he wasn't nice to his own family.
No,
but we haven't done the Tudors yet. So I don't know if you're interested in doing the Tudors, but the other thing we talked about doing was the Scottish kings.
Yes, we could do the Scottish kings. I'm not sure where you want to start with those.
I guess Kenneth MacAlpin is where you start.
Right.
Is there a case we're doing earlier, or?
I need to look back on it. But there are actually some. It turns out that there are some interesting political machinations that are going on in Scotland. If you remember that little kingdom of Dalriada,
the Irish.
Yes, and indeed the term Scot means Irish person.
Yeah, the Scotty.
The Scotty. And the reason that happened is because the Picts actually had a matrilineal monarchy. So it was the queen who was important. It was the female descendants, and they'd happily get males from outside their royal family and marry them to the queen. They did this. They got one of the Dalriadan leaders, and once he was married to the queen, he's gone, okay, enough of this matrilineal bullshit. We're going patrilineal, and I'm in charge, and my offspring are going to be in charge. And so that's sort of how Scotland became Scotland, because Irish people are pushy that way, I guess, or something.
Well, back then they were. I don't know about now, but
yeah. Well, if you've met Irish Demon, it's not like he's backward about coming forward.
Well, I haven't met him in the flesh since he went all sov sit. I sort of haven't paid too much attention to him. Not that I dislike him or don't wish him success or anything, because he's had much success with that. And I'm very pleased about that. I'm always glad to see good people succeeding, but it just has no interest to me for some reason. I don't know why sov sits are so popular. To me, it's just idiots being idiots. It's not like they're making bad arguments; they're just being stupid.
Well, I think
that the bad arguments you can attack, at least,
Yeah. Well, I think part of the point is that they share a lot of the traits of flat earthers, in the sense that society, I've made this point several times, society depends on communication, cooperation, and trust. And you will notice that flat earthers sabotage communication. They refuse to cooperate, and they don't trust anybody, and they aren't themselves trustworthy. And these three attributes are shared by sov citizens. Sovereign citizens don't trust anybody with authority. They do their best to confound any efforts at communication, and they don't cooperate, which sort of makes them part of an extensive class of antisocial activities. And one of the frustrating elements when you see for me, if I see a flat earther spouting nonsense, I get frustrated and angered by it.
That's every time you see a flat earther. Yeah.
If nobody is able to present a counter argument, I get frustrated and flustered by it, which is why I always, annoyingly ask people if I can speak to that. But the sov sits are the same. They're frustrating. Like, why are you choosing to do this way? It's completely unconstructive. It's completely destructive to society. All you're doing is imposing a cost onto us. And as Gareth points out, they grift. They take money off people, and generally vulnerable people. It feels appropriate to stop them. And given the recent event in Queensland, and the fact that Malcolm Roberts is a sovereign citizen, I think they need to be slapped. Slapped back to reality as often and as emphatically as they can be.
Well, there's plenty of people doing that, which is good.
But I can understand if you find them tedious and annoying and just prefer not to tune in.
Yeah, I think flat earthers are more fun because they're so obviously stupid.
So. Sovereign citizens are pretty much just as stupid. The flat earthers are amazingly dumb, like just really, really astonishingly stupid.
Well, actually, I was speaking to someone about my channel and things, and talking about flat earthers, and they were saying, they're a bit like pathological liars. And I said, yes, they're exactly pathological liars. They're lying to themselves. And you're right, sov citizens are doing the same. The thing that whenever I've seen a sov, I watch Radical once in a while. He's sort of gone sov cit. And I love the ones where they say, "Oh, I'm not driving. I'm traveling. I don't need a license for traveling." I mean, as if that was ever going to work.
Yeah. And And this is what I mean about the refusal to communicate. Yes, you are driving, you are operating a motor vehicle, and there are regulations that constrain the operation of motor vehicles. And we tried not having regulations, and it didn't work, and people died. So now we do have regulations, and if you want to operate a motor vehicle, you have to abide by the regulations, and failure to exposes you to consequences. And I know you don't want to listen to the consequences of your actions, but the rest of us do. So you can do it too. I don't know. They are every bit as annoying, but it's down to personal taste. I mean, there are plenty of stupid people in the world.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the fact that they don't appeal to me, sovereign states don't appeal to me, doesn't mean that they don't appeal to other people. Obviously, they do, and people have built good channels as based on that, such as Irish Demon and the Plot Hole and Magical and several and Team Skeptic. All people I really admire, but I don't tend to watch anymore because I'm not interested in that subject. That's just me.
Yeah. I can well understand your position in that regard. But it's in some senses, attacking idiotic, antisocial positions is a target-rich environment at this point in time. Yeah. There are just so many of them, and again, like there's a lot of victimization of people. I think need to be warned about what's going on. One of the things I worry about is, with flat earthers, is that a lot of the people who contribute to them, should be protected from being exploited in that fashion. And I feel the same about you.
I totally agree. Yeah, it's the same problem, isn't it? That we're trying to stop people from being manipulated in a malicious way. Mark Shaw says, my sister wants to be a sovereign, not a sovereign citizen, because that has the word citizen in it. I told her to look up the definition of sovereign. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, Charles III is a sovereign too.
Charles III is a sovereign, but you kind of need some agreement from some other people that you should be sovereign.
Yes.
In some sense.
Yes. He wouldn't be if Parliament hadn't proclaimed him as the sovereign. So.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder if all sovereign citizens are in fact citizens.
Well, they're born citizens, aren't they?
Are they?
They might not be acting as citizens, but
I think to be a citizen, in a technical sense, requires that you're in a city.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. That's the origin of the word. Yes.
Yeah. Ironically, I've been reading about the development of Proto-Indo-European, and I discovered recently that the terms rex, regulation, reign, and right all have the same root in Indo-European. So regulators, people who decide what is right or wrong, date back to our earliest Indo-European societies.
And being Indo-European, does that sort of imply that it dates back to Alexander the Great, who was the first person to sort of reign over Indo-European type lands?
No, much earlier than Alexander the Great. So Proto-Indo-European dates back to...
so it's more the Silk Route than...
Well, it dates back to just north of the Black Sea, just north of the Sea of Azov, about 2,500 to 3,000 BCE. So, 4,500 years ago. And it's fascinating to sort of look at how they reconstructed the language and how they sort of decided on decided where it came from and how it developed and that sort of stuff, and how they can tell from the language something about the society, even though they don't have much archaeology. They have some archaeology that will help them, but the social structures that they have come from the fact that the term rex or regulator or right all had the same root. So the idea of regulations, right versus wrong, and a decision maker. There's been the language reflects the fact that there's a single person or there's a narrow authority that is in charge of making those decisions. So it tells you something about the social structure. So it's just, I don't know. I'm finding it an interesting read.
Yeah, I've read things about place names in Wales indicate a lot about the history going back to the Dark Ages and things like that. It's fascinating when you get into these things. A lot of it's speculation, unfortunately, but yeah, it's interesting to think through. But anyway, I guess that's pretty much the end of the history part of our live stream tonight.
Well, I did a lot of talking, so I feel kind of guilty.
That's all right. Well, you did all the work as well, so you're entitled to do that. I mean, when I've done the presentations before, I've done most of the talking as a result, and you've corrected me, so that's good.
Well, I don't think of it as correcting often. I think of it as just having some trivia I want to share with you. So
and I did the same in this talk. I think there's a few things I sort of felt I could contribute, so I did. For those who are interested, I've got. You might have seen me in past live streams spin the wheel of derp. I've done one with Planet Walk and one with FTFE. And tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern Australian time, which I think is 6 a.m. UTC, I am doing that with MC Toon. So that should be a bunch of fun. We'll be talking about flirfs and how stupid they are and asking MC Toon the hard questions about each of those. So that should be fun. I don't think... yes, actually, there's one thing I can tell you about. On Australia Day, which is the 26th of January, so early in the morning on Australia Day, my time, so in the evening on the 25th of January, UTC, I am having a chat with Flatsoid. It's the first time I'm talking to a flat earther. None of them have been had the guts to talk to me before now, so this is a good thing for me. I've never been able to talk to him, so I'm hoping to sort of understand a bit more about how he ticks and what motivates him, and we'll see what happens in that conversation. It's not going to be a debate or anything like that. I'm just hoping to have a chat with him.
I have to say that Flatsoid, to some extent, falls into the category of flirts that I would describe as willfully dishonest, based on the fact that he presented video evidence that he had manipulated. And that requires effort, a willful desire to deceive, and I'm not entirely. So I hope you have an interesting conversation, but from what I've seen, that's a big red flag.
I agree, but I'm not going to bother talking to him about that because he's been spoken about it, and he basically claims that means he's exposed all of us for being dishonest. So I don't know how that works, but apparently, if he does something dishonest, that means all of us are dishonest. But anyway, I'd like to understand a bit more about how he works, because to me that makes no sense whatsoever. I'd like to understand what's the basis of his position, what motivates him, and we'll find out more about that, hopefully. But you never know. I'll have a chat to him and see what happens. Anyway,
I hope you have a very pleasant conversation. and get to the root of
He's one of the
root cause
more
of everything.
reasonable first, isn't he? In terms of having a conversation with him. He might be dishonest, but
I've never seen him in a conversation, so I can't judge that. But the fact that
Yeah.
he did up that video is about all that's about all the information I have. And he does say some extremely silly things like a right
He
angle
does.
is 60 degrees.
And he talks about the ether band, which is something only he talks about, so he's made it up.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask him to explain that to me, so I have some idea what the hell he's talking about. But I'm sure well, we'll see. We'll see what happens. So, and who knows if he'll show up? Hopefully he will.
Hopefully.
So, in terms of the history stream tonight, any closing words, Tony?
Not really. I do think that there are some interesting, it is very interesting to look back at sort of what people wrote. If you read Bede's, if you read Bede's history of the ecclesiastical history of the English people, it's very interesting because he's a real person, and he has. There's a Welsh priest who will not sleep under the same roof as an English person because he's so angry about the English invasion. And Bede is so upset about it, just so annoyed, really considers this to be unjust, and takes time out to write it in his history. And it is fascinating sometimes to read back and just ponder, even though they were removed by more than 1,000 years, these were people with, the same emotional concerns and the same, sometimes petty, misunderstandings and sort of temper tantrums that modern people exhibit. It kind of takes history away from being a dry list of facts to here are some real people. It's real people with real emotions and real experiences, and it's great to sort of, to my mind, it's what makes history really, really interesting, is trying to reconstruct the people that might be behind these events. But it's not for everyone, and if you're bored by that, I'm sorry for having subjected you to it.
Well, no need to apologise. It's always good to look at history because it tells something about other human beings, doesn't it? So, and they're people in different situations to what we are, but it shows the capabilities of human beings. And I think Flirfs do to some extent as well. And it's because most of the time we think, how the hell could any human being think that, is the way we react to it. Anyway, so that's history. So I think maybe Scottish Kings will be the next one we do.
Yes, I'll have to do some revision on that.
Yeah, we'll have a look at those. Thank you to everyone who's been watching. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow with a live stream spinning the wheel of dirt with MC2. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure we're... Oh, hang on, I'm not even ready. How about that? Where's the outro? I can't even see it. Now, there we are. Okay, so I think we've pretty much done it now. There's nothing left to do but cue the corgi.
You're despicable.